Namaste. Let us continue with this series on Heart to Heart, the lectures given by Pujya Sri Chariji Maharaj in 1987. Let's begin with the next lecture in this series, Condition and Experience, delivered on August 10th, 1987 at Eastern, USA. Yesterday, I was supposed to speak to you about spiritual experiences and conditions and the relationship between them, but I got sort of diverted away from the subject. I think it was necessary. Today, I shall again start on spiritual conditions and experiences and see where it goes. When we start meditation, when we get into this business of satsang and sahaj marg, there is a need and a tendency to judge our sittings by what we feel during the sittings or what we experience the conditions. That is always a problem in the beginning, and in some way we are also taught to expect that we should have experiences. But what is an experience? I don't know what is an experience, you see. The more we, or at least the more I live, I am beginning to doubt whether there is such a thing as experience. I don't know what to call what we experience, whether they are experiences or some sort of situation. It's like when you go out, you feel cold. Is it an experience? Of course, in the normal use of language, we say, I experienced cold outside. But to my way of thinking, it's not an experience at all. If I go and stand out in the cold, I feel cold. If I come back in the room, I feel warm. So I think we call all these things experiences. The food is an experience. The drive back to Seattle is an experience. Today, everything is an experience. If you sleep, well, it's an experience. If you don't sleep, it's another experience. So I think an experience, strictly speaking, should be something we should not have in the normal course of events. Something, shall we say, not germane to the situation, not natural in that situation. Something which shouldn't have happened. Suppose I were to go out and stand now outside under the trees in the cold and feel hot, that would be an experience. Or if I were to jump into the swimming pool or that canal down there and feel warm, that would be an experience. I mean, to feel cold where you should feel cold could hardly be called an experience. So this mistake we all very blithely make, that I closed my eyes and I felt that it was all dark. Of course, the lights have been switched off. I close my eyes and I see nothing but darkness. It is hardly an experience. Now, suppose you are to feel the reverse, that all the lights have been switched off, my eyes are closed, but I felt as if a pair of car headlights were focused on my face. That would be an experience. So the first thing we need to distinguish is what an experience and what it is not to most of us. In our anxiety, in our eagerness to experience something, we sort of convert everything into an experience. If it makes any sense to you, so that tendency to convert everything into an experience because we feel we should have an experience relates in some way to a need to have an experience rather than to the fact that there should be experiences during sitting. Now this is the first point we should note very carefully. The second is how to sift out the true experience from that which is natural to the situation. So we must know what is natural and what is not. Now if I should eat an apple and it should burn my tongue like pickles, that would be a very strange apple indeed, wouldn't it? Or if I should put in mango pickles full of hot chilies and taste it sweet, that would be strange too. So strangeness seems to indicate a more appropriate evaluation of what is an experience and what is not. Strangeness in the sense that should normally not be the feeling associated with that activity. So when we sit for meditation, we are normally expected to feel calm. We are normally expected to feel that thoughts or the level of thoughts has gone down. The frequency of thoughts has gone down. These are therefore not experiences. They are consequences of meditation. But most often the rookie Abhyasi says, "Sir, I had a wonderful experience today." What did you have? "Oh, I didn't have any thoughts today." And the preceptor is also happy. He says, "Wonderful." Technically, it is not an experience. It is a state induced in you by the fact of meditation, or shall we say, by the fact of correct meditation, right meditation, properly done. So when we start out with our diaries, of course, to us it is a valuable indication of how you are meditating. There is a separation of thoughts or a reduction in the level of thinking. You feel more calm, at peace with yourself, with the environment. These are states consequent on right meditation. So we have to distinguish between experiences and conditions or states. I think this is what Chinu and Lalita were asking me to elaborate yesterday. Now, the other thing is, when we have these two, there is not only a distinction between them, but there is an interplay between them, in the sense that when our condition is gross, when we are in the beginning stages of spiritual life, the grossness itself conditions the experience. It is like, when you have a fever, you cannot taste what you are eating properly. The taste eludes you. Smokers know that when they have a fever, they cannot enjoy a smoke. Now the tobacco hasn't changed. So something has changed in you. Your fever has made it impossible for you to perceive certain things. So our condition does have an effect on our experience. A very mundane example. We are traveling on the road in a very nice car through very scenic surroundings, but the man is sleeping, the passenger you see. How can he have an experience? So, to know what is an experience, you know whether it's really an experience. We have to be aware of our condition and also to be alert to note what is going on. A passive state in which we are almost asleep. Well, you would need thunder or lightning before you would know it is an experience. As they say, he has to be given a shock on the jaw before he feels anything. So, to have an experience and to experience the experience are two different things. Whether I am asleep or awake, the road is passing by. The scenes are going on. The beauties of nature are passing by. But to man who is asleep, it is as if they had never happened. But to one who is awake, who has an aesthetic sense of appreciation, who has color sense, form sense, he sees beauty in everything that he sees. A businessman only looks at the lumber and says, 11 Ah. Aha, what wonderful timber, and how many tons I could get out of an acre this sort of woodland. And some of these incendiaries might think what a wonderful place they could have if they set a matchstick to the whole thing. So you see, we see what we see, not because we see what we see, but because of what we are conditioned to see. I see what I think I see. Similarly, I hear what I think hear. To have only to judge the reaction of 4 people who are sitting around one person who is talking and then ask them, "What did you really hear today?" you would be shocked that all 4 have heard different things from the same person. At the same time. He is giving a talk and 4 people are listening and they have all heard different things. Similarly, consciousness, nothing makes an impression on the soul. What do you see? So you see, that is why I think we see sunrise after sunrise and it doesn't make an impression, said in the old tradition. In Christianity, for instance, expression, we see people dying one after the other and you have eyes but you see not, you have ears but makes no impression. We think we are going to be eternal, you hear not. He did not mean we were blind and deaf and eternally alive. When are you going to start meditation? He meant that having eyes, my dear friend, is not, "Oh, there is a lot of time for it, you see." Yea, but that is enough. Perception must be there. You must be able to, poor guy, 32 years old, he died yesterday. Yeah, sad. Evaluate what you are seeing and to know whether it is case, isn't it? But I am a strong man, and reality or a chimera of your imagination. It's very easy. My astrologer tells me I am going to live to 86. So we to walk out in this twilight and imagine ghosts, leave our destiny in the hands of astrologers and in the everywhere around us, something moving in the wind medical textbook, and a timid fellow thinks it's a ghost. I would probably, it would probably, he died of cancer. I don't have cancer. So I am not think it's a bear. Somebody else would think it's something to die. A very, very funny way of logic. Because, but what is it that is really going on there? My death is not related to any other death in a so. To have eyes is not enough. My living is not associated with any other. Very often I am sitting in my room here and I hear I living in the universe. I live, I exist independently. Be this whispering of the wind in the trees, and I think it's cause of my sanskaras. Does one car move on the road? Then inevitably, shall we say, by the grace of the Almighty, the circumstance changes. Next morning, you wake up to the glorious vista of a new dawn, a new life opening into your existence, and you wonder how you could have had these almost blasphemous thoughts yesterday of ending your existence. What right have I to end my existence? Because today it is dark. Tomorrow is going to be light again, dawn again, a new glorious day again, when my whole outlook on life is going to be changed all over again, and I would feel the biggest fool if next morning I didn't exist to feel these things. That is one reason why suicide is a crime, not a social crime or a legal crime, but a moral crime. Because when you terminate your life by an act of annihilation aimed at yourself, you are violating the first principle of nature, that everything changes almost continuously, and by virtue of having put a stop to your existence, you have put a stop to the possibility of change. It is anti-evolutionary. Therefore, no man, no woman, and no child has a right over its own life, much less over the life of another person. Therefore, moral law says, thou shalt not kill. If you have no right over your own existence, your own life, because nature in its infinite mercy opens infinite possibilities. Every moment of your existence, how can you put a stop to those potentialities developing in me? And if I cannot do that to myself, how dare I do it to another? So this is the thing that we have to associate with a spiritual existence, that on one side I am all alone sitting in meditation, perhaps feeling lonely for the first time in my life, because I close my eyes and I immediately lose contact with everybody else. Which is perhaps one reason why in the West you want to sit so close together, holding hands sometimes, too, which is despicable. Because in that situation you must feel what it must be like to be all alone by yourself in a universe as vast as you can hardly ever imagine. What is it to be alone? And then you will find you are not really alone there. I mean, it's very miraculous. To say it's powerful is a very weak term. To say it is forceful is even weaker, you see. It is something which is exhilarating. Then you feel like opening your chest and breathing and letting out a song of glory to nature, gratitude to God, and saying, aha, for the first time I feel what it is not to be lonely. I am alone, but not lonely. I open my eyes. I am with 200 people, but I always was lonely. So this is the experience that we should aspire for. Not these ordinary things of I felt like insects creeping on my head and I felt like somebody was breathing down my neck. So we have to shift very carefully what is an experience from what is not an experience. We have become too prone, especially in the West, to think of everything as an experience. Somebody who starts smoking for the first time in his life, he says, "Oh, that was a wonderful experience, Chari." Nothing of the sort. It's like a man who is going to drink his first cup of coffee and he says, "It's a wonderful experience." All that you have the right to say is, "I took coffee for the first time in my life and it was awful." It generally is. The same thing goes for smoking. When you start for the first time, you feel nauseated. You feel like bringing out everything. Then slowly, you condition yourself into thinking it's high and mighty and only the big guys do it. Then you change brands until you come to the most expensive one and draw satisfaction from that. $1 cigars, $2 cigars, $5 cigars. Tobacco is tobacco, whatever you pay for it. So you see how we can convert an ordinary mundane thing like drinking coffee into an experience, or a smoke into an experience, and then to boost our ego into saying, "Yes, you are right. We put more and more money on that experience to prove to ourselves that it's a valuable experience." So instead of accepting the reality of an experience, we are loading what we suppose to be an experience with all the unreality that we can possibly load onto it, and present it as something novel, something unique, something wonderful. This tendency we should not sort of import into our meditative states, because the whole idea of meditation is to perceive reality, to become one with the reality that we perceive. Finally, to merge into that reality ourselves so that our separate identity no longer exists. So we have to be careful. We have to be discriminating, because in yoga, discrimination is of the highest value and necessity. Swami Vivekananda was called Vivekananda, meaning the bliss of discrimination, because he had such a tremendously vast intellectual capacity, unknown normally in those who are supposed to be yogis. Because in India we have this suspicion of the intellect, suspicion of the thinking, cognitive faculty. What that when a man can think, he can think into existence almost everything that he desires to create for himself. He can think himself into being happy while he is miserable. He can think himself into misery while he is really active and happy, all by the power of thought. So the traditional Hindu yogic schools have always been suspicious about the intellect, its function and its place in life, and have even warned us to stay away from that fascination of intellect, because more often than not it will guide you into the byways where we have no business to be, and it fascinates. It does not reveal reality. Intellectual fascination is a very powerful force, because it is its nature to fascinate. Now in yoga, we are not there for the fascination, not even of God. God does not fascinate. He is not a blooming beauty with a 6 foot long golden hair and a visage like sun rising over the horizon. All those are left to the poet's imagination, you see. What is God in reality? We have to find out. Eventually, you may find out that this guy stares into the mirror and there comes God out of it with a rather silly smile on his face and pair of glasses on his nose, and he says, "Hey Paul," and you say, "Who are you?" And he says, "You have been looking for me all your life." You? And then we say, "For heaven's sake," and I have been looking over the whole world and through the universe, through time for this, and I find myself, which is very tremendously powerful truth, because in yoga the truth is you look for God and you find yourself, capital S. So that is why we look inside. That is why in all the mystic traditions they don't look for God somewhere in heaven, far away from here, where you have to go on a pilgrimage. John Bunyan stuff. Very nice to read about it, because human beings want to achieve something with great difficulty. They don't feel achievement unless there is a trouble, possible danger, risk associated with that achievement. Something which is easy we tend to poo-poo. Oh, it couldn't be worth much. So, this enormously fascinating adventure that when at the end of my journey I look into the face of the Almighty and find my face staring back at me, almost implying, "Damn fool, there I was right inside you, and you were searching for me through eons of time, through innumerable existences in various forms, starting from the ooze in the ocean, step by step evolving, when you could have come to me direct. All that you needed to see was to look inside yourself, look for God there, and you would have found me. And in finding me, you would have found yourself too. But beware, it says, when you look for yourself, you find nothing. Look for God, you find yourself. Look to yourself for find nothing." That is the message of the ancient traditions anywhere you see. One you call selfishness, the other you call search for the self. Concern for the self, concern for the welfare of the self. Therefore, outwardly you may find the yogi being careful on the food that he eats or bears in the woods of fast flowing streams, not because he is selfish, but because at his level of existence he has no authority, no permission to risk his life in any stupid ventures associated with adventure in the West. He dare not. He is not permitted to. Very often, I used to find my master criticized. He used to tentatively put out a foot and then only put his foot down. So people used to say, "What's he afraid of?" He wasn't afraid of anything. I mean, one whom he thought to be the creator of the universe could hardly be afraid of his own creation. It's like a man building a sand castle on the beach and then running away from it because he is afraid somebody is going to shoot him from inside, isn't it? But his law of existence says your life is sacred. It has evolved into what it is today after millions of misery-filled existences. You have no right to take any chances. And why should you exist? Suppose my master had asked his master, "Why should I exist?" He had a job to do. Now we are all running away from these seminars, some on Saturday night, some on Wednesday night. Why? Because we have a job to do. "Oh, I have got to work Tuesday morning, Chari. I am very sorry, but you know how it is in the States." Well, they don't have any less of a job to do. If your job earning a few petty dollars, turning out things again and again through machines which only replicate nauseatingly the same thing, even pizzas, even your apples, even your oranges, graded stuff. There is no originality about anything you eat here. It is a nauseatingly repetitive society, coast to coast. Your pizza is the same coast to coast. Your hamburgers are the same, and for this we put in our work. We earn our almighty dollars. We build our houses, and we are afraid to take a day off for spiritual adventures where really for the first time your life is going to flower out into something you can hardly ever have imagined as possible. But that is the way society runs. I have got to work Tuesday morning. So you see how inflexible are the demands that we create for ourselves by putting ourselves into situations where such demands exist. Spiritual law says, be free. It doesn't mean, of course, that we go around without a job and poaching stuff. It only means assign priorities. How much do you need to exist? $30,000 a year? Well, make it and stop. Devote the rest of your time to spirituality. Don't make 40, 50, 60, 70 and get into this rat race or like a rat being caught on a windmill and it doesn't know how to jump off. I dare say nobody here knows how to jump off the particular windmills they are stuck into. So along comes the master and says, sit down and meditate. The truth will be revealed to you. But accept the truth when you see it. Don't say, oh, this is some funny Indian situation. Close your eyes and you see reality. For heaven's sake, We have always been told to look at reality with open eyes, and then they come out with spacious arrangements. Chari, how can you know a girl is beautiful with your eyes closed? Well, if she is really beautiful, you will know it with your eyes closed too. Try it. If an apple is good, you don't have to eat it with your eyes open. The eyes only give you the color and the form, and the Californians want the best, not and the Californian wants the biggest, not the best. Biggest oranges ever grown in the states are in the state of California. The biggest car, the biggest pumpkins, and I dare say the biggest fools. Because with this idea of bigness or something as something valuable, you see, you have lost sight of quality, which is the essence of things, and you have impinged an artificial value on size. So reality says small or big, it is good if it is good. A diamond is a diamond, whether it is 1 cent or a 1 million carats. As big as this world, it's still a diamond. As I said yesterday, most diamonds in any case go to the industrial tools. So, like that, we are tool bits, you see. Now, when can you become of value to the maker? You know, like the mine owner, the diamond mine owners of Kimberley, they grade their diamonds into stuff. The small stuff is just perhaps put in big sacks and sold off. You see industrial diamonds. The big ones are preserved sometimes for years, like you mature wines in vats before they are bottled, because this is a gem dust. This is just a diamond. It is a gem. Similarly, nature grades is just as a human beings. This is saint. Let me look him, protect him, nourish him, cherish him. I myself have to work. Nature needs saints because nature is a blind force. It has no discrimination. It has no evaluating abilities. It just works blindly. Certain laws are set in motion. There is a heat wave. The temperature soars. The air currents go deep. There is a vacuum created here in rushes the cold air with the clouds, and there is rain. It doesn't know whether you need rain, whether it's going to flood your countryside, whether it's going to devastate the standing crops, or perchance it's going to irrigate and bring new life into your fields. It doesn't know any of these things. So the saint is nature in human form, with the capacity to work with the mind and with the heart. Now he can evaluate. When do I need rain? It comes. When do I need to stop it? It stops. I mean literally. It is no joke. It is not an exaggeration. Very literally, they can control this world, this universe. So now who is God? Such a person who would say, well, I pray to God. You see, my master always used to say, I shall pray to Lalaji, or I shall pray to God for you. Often I used to wonder whether he is a liar or whether he is just being pious, or he was just passing me, getting the tick of his. But if you seen him in action, you knew that he did pray occasionally when circumstances warranted it, when his utter humility, utter humanness, having a necessary powers of this universe, he would felt necessary. It is necessary to invoke the presence of God in him and do it. The higher presence was himself too. From where does it come? It is coming from within himself. He is drawing upon resources hidden in himself, of which he was never aware until he exerted himself to the point of extinction. Therefore, spirituality says, die before you die, and you shall see what is glory of death itself, what it opens out beyond into, the eternal life that is promised. It only means doing what the runner is doing, you see. That you run until you are almost collapsing, and then you find the miraculous awakening of fresh powers inside yourself, from inside yourself, of which you could never have dreamed, because you never exerted yourself to that level before. Spirituality says that is the outer world. Here you do it inside. Close your eyes, meditate, and the feeling comes that I am diving deep into some sort of bottomless hole, very dark. And then the tendency, sometimes the need, is to open one's eyes to reassure oneself that one is still in this world of human beings. That is the danger. It is like the runner stopping at the 15th mile to see, oh, do I have that hidden resource that Cherry was talking about? You can't feel it. It's gone, you see. It's like, the petrol tank. Sometimes we used to have, I don't know whether you still have an emergency small tank which you opened up when the main tank went dry. Some drivers were careless. They left it open all the time. So when it stopped finally because the reserve petrol tank was always open. The idea of a reserve tank is the capacity should be reserved for those emergent occasions when there is no gas station nearby. Then you open it and move to the nearest place. But if you are leaving it open all the time, you have lost the capacity to have control over it, which is what we are doing with our physical energies, draining them to the last possible drop of essence, and then when the need for the reserve comes, it just isn't there. So the sensible human way of living is not to drain your reserve capacities unnecessarily in any field. One of the reasons for morality, for celibacy is that reserve your capacity for the ultimate spurt. Don't waste it on your routine judging and your swimming. Routine jogging and your swimming. Yesterday I did 9, today I did 10, tomorrow 14. Then the reserve tank becomes meaningless. It hardly exists for us. So you see, when we go into meditation, we learn all these things, that I have to die in my meditation, to be reborn in that meditation, and to come out yet the same Paul, the same Bill, the same whatever you are, you see, but with a very, very different outlook on life, with a very, very different insight that how that has now been openly changed. I repeat again. So you see, when we go into meditation, we learn all these things, that I have to die in my meditation to be reborn in that meditation, and to come out yet the same Paul, the same Bill, the same whatever you are, you see, but with a very, very different outlook on life, with a very, very different insight that has now been opened, changed, cleaned up, refurbished in some mysterious way. There are, every time we sit in meditation and we go deep into it, we come out new, renewed, you can say. That is why meditation is refreshing. That is why meditation is never exhausting. However deep you go into it, you come out fresh. Pains are gone, aches are gone, more of the heart, which is very great need. There is solace derived from ourselves, from within ourselves, by ourselves. So we see this in a very real sense. We are becoming independent of the universe. We seek no solace outside, we get it inside. Others take renewal from outside, we get it from inside. The others take renewed strength from outside, we get it from inside. The ultimate experience that within me is in inside. You cannot measure this at all. It is truly infinite. Being truly infinite, its resources are truly infinite. Its potentials are truly infinite. Therefore, spiritual law says, go within and you are going towards infinity. Go outwards, there is only repetition of the same experience, nauseatingly repeated again and again. But you think you are enjoying a new thing every day. So spirituality says, beware of external life. That is only a mirror image of yourself. You see, like when you stand in a hall of mirrors and you are there alone, yet you see 100 of you surrounding you. Here the Atman, the soul, sees itself reflected in so many other existences. Whether they are real or not, who can say? You think I am real to you. I think you are real to me. Perhaps both of us don't exist. It is in some dreamer's mind, cosmic dreamer's mind, you see. It's frightening. It's all fascinating, frightening, because it is almost impossible to imagine that I don't exist. We are always afraid of death. That's a very natural fear. But to be told that perhaps, my dear friend, you don't exist, even now would be awful, wouldn't it? But when you plunge into yourself in meditation, and if by Master's grace, by the solemnity of your experience, you are able to experience those spiritual states where you find just first nothing, then you find yourself all alone, and then you find that the universe into which you are put all alone by yourself is really you. The universe is you. You are there at something experiencing yourself in a cosmic form. Then comes this, really brilliant, fascinating experience that I am the universe, which means you are part of me. Everybody is part of me. You are me in a sense, you see. Then comes the possibility of true love, true sympathy, not because of some charitable instinct of doing good to others, but because in you is also my existence. In keeping you alive, I keep myself alive. In feeding you, I feed myself. In looking after your welfare lies my welfare. In a very real, heartfelt sense, not out of a sense of charity, not out of even a sense of brotherhood, but out of a sense of an absolute need, like a car will not run if one of its tires is punctured. We are not being altruistic when we stop and patch up that tire. It will not move if the spark plugs are gone. It will not move if its fuel pipe is cut. So the functioning of the automobile depends on the functioning of every part that is put into it. No part is more important than the others, because all need to function before the car will move. Similarly, if God is ever to be having peace of mind and contentment and happiness, He must ensure a universe that is content and happy and peaceful. And we at the scale of existence have also to ensure it. That is the true need of brotherhood. When I see inside myself that I am the universe, you are all, of course, within the universe, and therefore you are part of me. Not just somebody I have to look after, but somebody I have to look after as if I had to look after myself. Can you have a bath without wetting your feet? No, I hate my feet to wet. I will have bath. It is not, but not wet the feet. It is not possible. The whole has to be wet, the whole. To be soaked, the whole has to be dried in the wholeness. In the consciousness of the wholeness now arises my awakened being, and we see this vast unlimited glory that we are all one, not in the sense that we are all together. Therefore, we are one. Wherever you may be, wherever I may be, we are still one. Now, whether that is a condition or whether it is an experience, your guess is as good as anybody else's. I would say that without that condition, you couldn't have that experience. So in spirituality, I would hazard the suggestion that every experience to be real must be backed by a condition of existence which is real, a state of existence which is real, and that is no mystery at all. I must be happy before I can feel happy. I must be sad before I can feel sad. I must have pain inflicted on me before I can feel pain. Otherwise, you call this state suggestive, auto-suggestive, or just neurotic. When you feel something that is not there, we say there are neurotic persons. In spirituality, there is no space or no place for neurotics. So the condition comes first, the experience comes subsequently. Then I have no difficulty in distinguishing the condition and the experience, because they are part of the same thing. I see the thing because the thing exists. If the thing didn't exist and I saw it, it would be a fantasy. It would be a hallucination. So it is the difficulty about understanding the spiritual jargon. It's what you are doing all the time, except that transported to the inner existence, to the inner universe within myself, which is me. I find it difficult to understand how a condition and an experience can be same thing. So these are the things I should have said yesterday, but I have tried in a small way to sort of analyze, you see, the differences. So when you sit in meditation, please try to be discriminative. It's not enough to say, I will, you will, well, you know, Chari, I felt pain here. Yes, of course, because you are used to the cushions all the time in your pampered existence, and when you sit for the first time on the floor, everything seems to prick, and you know that's not an experience. That's the reality of the floor on which we must have sat before. If you had sat before like that, today we wouldn't feel it. So we must try to be discriminative. Is this an experience, or is this just an impact of the universe on me? And then write our diaries, not forgetting what I said yesterday, that if I am the universe, whether I feel it or not, whether I perceive it or not, because yoga, meditation, the ultimate truth only enables me to see as I am, not as I am something to be in the future, you see. Then by virtue of that fact, we are already one organism with different parts like the stomach and the intestines, and whether I wish to reveal it or not, you already know something about me. And per contra, whether you wish me to know it or not, the master can know everything about you. So the best way is to sit in meditation, ruminate afterwards. What was this that I felt? Was it a feeling? Was it an experience? Anyway, let me write it down, because now I am not able to discriminate, but the fact of writing itself will train me in the discriminative faculties, and I shall be able to write better and better as I go. So may the Master's blessings be with you. Thank you for listening. We'll commence our next lecture in the next narration video.